I wonder, have you ever gone on vacation, and when you returned home from vacation, you realized that you needed a vacation from your vacation? You ever done that? I mean, why is it that we take time off to step away, and then we pack so much stuff into that time that we've scheduled away that we're almost busier when we're away than we are during a normal week? Why do we do that? I'm going to get to spend some time later this month, 6 days actually, in one of my favorite places in the world, in a little cabin in the wilderness in southern Quebec. And I've been thinking about what I'm going to take with me in that on that trip, and thinking about the books that I want to take with me, and the sermons that I hope that I can massage a little bit. And I'm going to take my staff file and my mission file and my vision file, and taking all that stuff with me. And as I was thinking about all that this week, the Holy Spirit whispered to me, you know what? The last time you were up there, you didn't touch those things. And then the Holy Spirit said, I want you, David, not what you do. I want you, not what you do. Why is it that downtime can end up being utterly exhausting? Maybe it's because we haven't ever really understood or practiced this business called Sabbath. Sabbath. I want to talk a little bit about that this morning. Sabbath. If you're following in the readings, Bible readings that we give you every week in the bulletin, we've just started the book of Genesis. Yesterday was Genesis 1 and 2, the creation stories in the Old Testament. And we read in Genesis chapter 1 that God got busy creating, and He separated the light from the darkness, and then He separated the waters above from the waters below. And then He created land in the midst of the waters. He got the vegetation to grow on the land. And then in order to help with seasons, He put the moon and the stars and the sun in the sky. And then He created the critters that walk around the world and on the earth, and the critters that swim in the sea. That was day 5. And then day 6 comes along, and God creates us. God creates humankind. So God created humankind in His image. In His image He created them. Male and female He created them, Genesis 1 says. And then Genesis 1 says that He spoke to those first 2 human beings and said, I want you to be fruitful and increase on the face of the earth. And then after day 6 was over with, God looked at everything that He had created, Genesis 1 says, and behold, He saw that it was all very good. And then day 7 came. And the early verses of chapter 2 in Genesis says that God rested on the 7th day. And that God blessed that 7th day and hallowed it and set it apart. Because God worked for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, He rested. And a rhythm for living was introduced to the world. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and the people of God are gathered around the foot of a mountain called Sinai. And the servant of God, Moses, had gone to the top of the mountain to receive the words of God. And after about 40 days, he came back down the mountain. And he had in his hands what we've come to call the 10 Commandments. And one of those commandments, number 4, is to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. I want you to think about the 10 Commandments maybe a little different than you have in the past. The 10 Commandments aren't something that God has given us with duty and responsibility and requirement attached to it. Rather, the 10 Commandments come to you and to me as these loving boundaries that God has put in place. See, God wants us to experience life fully the way that He intended it to be. And God says, here's how your life is going to be able to be lived optimally if they're lived within these boundaries. And one of those boundaries is every seventh day, rest. Don't work. Rest. By the time Jesus comes along, the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, they had attached a couple hundred other laws to the law that is to remember the Sabbath day. They were so worried about breaking the law of Sabbath that they attached a whole bunch of other laws to it to keep them from breaking the Sabbath law. You weren't allowed to break the laws that they put in place any more than you were allowed to break the Sabbath law itself. And the laws were kind of crazy. Like working would be if you decided to walk out into your kitchen and open the cabinet and pull out a Reese's peanut butter cup and open it and eat it. That was working. And you were breaking the law at that point. Crazy, right? So Jesus thought it was pretty crazy too. At the end of Mark chapter 2, here's a Sabbath story. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields. And as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. That was a no-no. They had determined that even if you pick a head of grain on a Sabbath day, you are working and you are breaking the law. Crazy, right? Jesus thought so. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" And Jesus answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. And then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And there's a sentence missing at the end of that. At the end of chapter 2, it says, "So the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Jesus thought this crazy business of picking a grain of wheat on a Sabbath day if you're hungry was breaking the law. He said, that's nuts. If people are hungry, it's not about keeping the law. It's about caring for the purposes of God. And he uses this example in 1 Samuel chapter 21. David had been anointed king. We'll look at that story in a couple weeks. David had been anointed king. He was the future of God's people and God's purpose in the world. King David was. Problem was, King Saul was still the king. And King Saul and King David didn't like each other a whole lot. And so David heads into this town called Nob, N-O-B, where there's a priest there by the name of Ahimelech. Ahimelech is actually Abiathar's father. And David goes into town, and he goes under false pretenses because he says to Ahimelech, "We are here on a mission for the king." Well, not really. David and his men are running for their life. But they say to Ahimelech, "We are hungry. We need sustenance. Do you have anything to eat?" And Ahimelech says, "The only thing I have is the bread of the presence." What was that? The bread of the presence was consecrated bread that was kept on a table in the worship space. And the bread there in that place meant that God was in that place, the bread of the presence. And the only people that were authorized to eat that bread were the consecrated priests. So what did Ahimelech do? Ahimelech somehow understood that the future of God's people rested with David. The purpose of God was with David. And so he was willing to give the consecrated bread to David and his companions so that David's journey could continue. What do we learn from that? We learn that the purposes of God, what is at the heart of who God is and what God does in the world, is so much more important than ritualistic observances. So much more important than that. And then he says, Jesus does, to the disciples, and by the way, the Sabbath was made for man, not the other way around. Sometimes we think of it differently. We think that, oh, I have to go to church. I have to observe the Sabbath because if I don't, God's going to zap. No. The Sabbath was made for us. It's a gift for us. It's not the other way around. And then Jesus adds that phrase, and by the way, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He is saying, look, I remember the first Sabbath. I was there when it was day 7. I remember that. I know all about Sabbath. And I'm here to tell you that the Sabbath was made for us, for people, not the other way around. And then Mark chapter 3 gives us an example of what it looks like for Jesus to be Lord of the Sabbath. Check it out. Another time, Jesus went into a synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with a shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath to do? To do good or to do evil? To save life or to kill?" But they remained silent. And he looked around at them in anger. Don't miss that. Does Jesus get angry sometimes? There it is. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. Don't miss that part. See, Jesus is not concerned about Sabbath as a regulation. He's concerned about the fact that there was a man there who had been suffering with this shriveled hand. Who knows how many times, how many Sabbaths that guy had walked into the synagogue with this shriveled hand, with this suffering. But you weren't allowed to heal on the Sabbath. See, you could heal on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, but not on Friday evening and not on Saturday. You had to come back another day. It's crazy. But Jesus said, no. Sabbath is for humankind. Sabbath is for people. And if there is suffering on a Sabbath day, why wouldn't you heal? Why wouldn't you set somebody free? But all the Pharisees could think about was the fact they needed to get this guy out of the way, this Jesus. They couldn't see beyond their ritual observances to the need of humankind. No wonder he got angry, right? No wonder. You see, Sabbath is a gift. It's not a regulated duty for you and for me. It exists for God's purpose, not ours. And just like all of the other commands that God gives us, it comes from His loving heart so that our lives can be what He wants them to be, what they were designed to be. So why would He include Sabbath in that design? Why would He do that? Well, I think, first of all, the answer to that question is that if your life is like mine, it's difficult to think about God 24/7. Can I get a witness? You know that. Our lives are crazy and filled with all kinds of stuff and busyness and distractions and anxiety-creating things. And I think God said, you know what? I'm just going to set aside one day out of 7 to make it a priority to think about me, to remember who I am, to remember who you are as my children. He knows that we're busy. He knows that life is chaotic. And so He says, one day in 7, work 6, rest 1, and think about me. But I wonder if He doesn't know something more about us. I wonder if He knows that left to our own design, what will we do? Work, 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 work. Are you out there? work, work. That's us. We will just keep on achieving until the moment comes when we worship what we've achieved and not the one who gave us the ability to achieve it. God knew that. And so God rested on the seventh day as an example for what the rhythm of life is intended to be for you and for me. See, as crazy as it is, we were never, ever created to work our fingers to the bones. That was not the intention of the God that put us together. In fact, anytime the Bible talks about productivity, it always has Sabbath worked into the mix. Always. Jesus understood Sabbath. He practiced it. He stepped away for his own Sabbath time where he thought about God and connected to God and focused on the purposes of God. See, the whole purpose of Sabbath is rest. Resting in the presence of God. Resting in the purposes of God. Think about that word for me just a minute, rest. You ever thought about what rest means? I mean, if you are resting, you are not what? You're not working. So rest in a very, very simple way is to simply stop working. Stop working. But rest means something else, doesn't it? Have you ever rested something against something else? Do you know what I mean? Like you've rested a picture in one of those little easels that you put the picture in on the stand someplace. You rest. Another meaning of rest is to lean something against something else. An example, my keister right now is resting on this stool. Okay? It is. It's resting on this stool. This stool is holding it up. And the floor is holding up the stool that's underneath me. That's another understanding of rest. It's to quit working, and it's to think a little bit about what life is resting on. I wonder if that's what God had in mind with Sabbath. I wonder if he meant both things. Stop working. Take a 24-hour period of time. Stop working. And use that time to think a little bit about what your life is resting on. See, if we ignore that time, if we ignore the Sabbath, man, that comes with a hefty price tag. And there's some folk in this room, folk listening to me right now that understand pretty clearly what that means. Am I on? You know what that means. Well, what does it mean? What happens if we ignore Sabbath, Pastor? Well, think about this with me. If we ignore the Sabbath, then we lose our connection with God. Our connection with God is challenged because we're so busy and we have so many places to go and things to do that if there isn't this period of time when we intentionally think about God, then it's awful easy for God to get lost in the rest of our daily living, right? If we ignore the Sabbath, boy, that's a fast track to exhaustion, isn't it? Physically and mentally and spiritually at the same time. One of my favorite books about leadership is a book written by Peter Scazzero called The Emotionally Healthy Leader. And Pete Scazzero in that book talks a lot about Sabbath, and he says, in order for leaders to be healthy, there has to be Sabbath. There has to be rest. But here's the cool thing. Pete Scazzero also wrote another book called Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. And the suggestion there, as he talks about Sabbath in that book too, is that you and I, as people who follow Jesus, we've got to have Sabbath. To follow Jesus requires Sabbath. Here's one of the things Scazzero says. God often does stop us when we repeatedly violate our limits and disregard our need for rest. Would you agree? That God often does stop us. If you refuse the gift of Sabbath, sooner or later, one way or another, you will find yourself flat on your back. Emotionally, physically, and or spiritually. Would you agree? If you ignore it, you can't escape it. See, friends, summer vacation is not rest. Taking a week off. Come on, you know that. That's not rest. Retirement isn't rest. You guys who are retired, you're busier now than you were when you were working. That's not rest. Retirement isn't rest. I'll do Sabbath after I retire. Good luck. Rest, as God defines it, is taking a set period of time and turning off everything else so that you can tune in to God, who He is, who we are. Scazzero says we've got our rhythms mixed up in our life. See, we live by this rhythm, a secular rhythm, which is work, vacation. Work, vacation. And if what I just said about vacation is right, then it's work some more. Work some more. But the Sabbath rhythm, the secular, the sacred rhythm is different. Sabbath and work. And Sabbath and work. And Sabbath and work. Do you see the difference? See, we were created for the sacred rhythm. The fallen world that we live in is created the secular one. And we have to make a choice about which rhythm we're going to march to. Because see, there's one more thing that happens when we ignore Sabbath. If we ignore Sabbath, we cannot love God with everything that we have. Remember the great commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself? You and I can't love God with all that we have if we are not going to live within the boundaries that God has lovingly given us. It's impossible to do that. To love God with all that we've got is to also love the boundaries that He's put in place for our living, to say that those boundaries are good because they've come from you, God, the one who put us together. We hear the word command, and we hear automatically duty and requirements and things that will happen to us if we don't fulfill the command. But what if that all comes from the heart of this loving God? What if the commands come as loving boundaries? Remember what Willie said last week, that the heart of God exudes love. Everything that God does comes from this heart of love, including the boundaries that He's put in place for you and for me. I think Pete Scazzero defines Sabbath better than anybody else. Sabbath is a 24-hour block of time in which we watch this: stop work, enjoy rest, practice delight, and contemplate God. Wow. Stop rest, stop working, enjoy rest, practice delight, do something that brings you joy, and contemplate God. Can I ask you, what would it look like for you to practice Sabbath like that? It's going to have to be intentional, isn't it? You're going to have to intentionally do it. Because if we just wait for it to happen, how's that working for you? It doesn't. We have to be intentional about it. That's why God said every 7 days, rest. Maybe a story will help. Pete Scazzero, in the book Emotionally Healthy Leader, when he wrote the book, B&H Photo, located on 9th Avenue in New York City, B&H Photo, at the time Pete Scazzero wrote the book, was the largest non-chain photo and video store in the United States. The owner of B&H Photo, as well as a lot of the people that work at B&H Photo, are Hasidic Jews. What does that mean? It means that they practice their faith and they even dress exactly like their Eastern European ancestors did in the 18th century. Every day, 8,000 to 9,000 people walk in and out of the store that B&H Photo has on 9th Avenue, New York City. Get that. 8,000 to 9,000 people in and out of that store every day. But 70% of their business happens from online orders. Wow. You don't even have to walk in the store to order something from B&H Photo. Here's the thing. Every Friday afternoon at 1 o'clock, the store closes. And it stays closed all the way through Saturday, the biggest shopping day of the week in New York City. Why would they do that? Tell me. Sabbath. They're Hasidic Jews. They shut down their store at 1 o'clock on Friday, and it's closed all the way through Saturday. You can peruse the stuff on the internet, but you can't order anything in that period of time. One time on a Black Friday, y'all remember Black Friday? Remember the Friday after Thanksgiving before that massive shopping weekend? One day on Black Friday before B&H Photo closed, a customer approached the communications director for B&H Photo. And the customer was just incredulous. I can't imagine that you are going to close at 1 o'clock on Black Friday and that you're going to stay closed the whole next day. That's just crazy. Do you know how much money you're going to lose by doing that? The communications director didn't miss a beat, smiled, and simply said, well, we respond to a higher authority. We respond to a higher authority. What if that's what Sabbath rest is about? What if for 24 hours you and I would respond to a higher authority? What if we practiced thanks but a little bit? What do you mean? Well, I don't know about you, but when I take a day off, I will often look myself in the mirror at the beginning of the day and I'll say to myself, you've got a lot of things to get done today. Anybody else? You know what I'm talking about? Got a lot to do today. What if when that happens, you would say to yourself on that day of rest, thanks, but I'm responding to a higher authority today. How many times has this happened to you? Hey, phone rings. Hey, I heard you took a day off. Can you come help me with something? Ever happen? You know what I'm talking about? What if when the phone rang on that day, you said, thanks, but I'm responding to a higher authority today? What if in that 24-hour period of time, you set the news aside and you didn't get on Facebook? Some of you will need medicated for withdrawal symptoms. But what if in that period of time, you said to the news and you said to social media, thanks, but I'm responding to a higher authority today? See, that's Sabbath. For 24 hours, stop working, enjoy rest, practice delight, contemplate God, and watch how the hours after that will suddenly be much, much different. Respond to a higher authority. By the way, that's not a bad phrase to use for all of our living, wouldn't you say? I'm responding to a higher authority. So I'll leave you with two things. The first is a quote from C.S. Lewis. God cannot give us happiness and peace apart from Himself because it is not there. Get it? There is no such thing as happiness and peace apart from God. And then I thought this was pretty good. There is literally nothing in nature that blooms all year long, so do not expect yourself to do so. There is nothing in nature that blooms all year long. Do not expect you to do so. Sabbath.